Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you to this special event on the role of forest in a post-COVID-19 recovery, reimagining the future of forests. We have followed almost 3 days of very interesting and stimulating discussions at this wonderful 15th World Forestry Congress, which is kindly hosted by the government of the Republic of Korea and the Korean Forest Service. At this session, please allow me to introduce my fellow co-moderator brother, Dr. John Parota, and myself. My name is Sham Satguru. Dr. John Parota is the chairperson of AYUFRO, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. As for myself, I come from the International Tropical Timber Organization based in Japan. Now, without further ado, let me take you through the quick flow of the session today. The session is artificially divided into 2 sessions, session 1 and session 2. We will begin with session 1, whose task is assessing the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic for the forest and tree sector. We have a wonderful lineup of panelists for this particular session. We have a keynote speaker also. And may I have the pleasure now in inviting the keynote speaker, Madame Maria Helena Semedo, who is the Deputy Director General from the FAO, to present her keynote address.
Good afternoon to all here and connected virtually to this event. Excellencies, dear friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special event on the role of forests in a post-COVID-19 recovery. The COVID-19 pandemic is one of the greatest crises the world has experienced in recent times, affecting more than 600 million people and causing over 6 million deaths to date. It has disrupted global supply chains, health systems, livelihoods, and commodity markets. The COVID-19 pandemic also spotlighted the risk of new emerging zoonotic diseases due to a closer contact between humans and wild animals, resulting from deforestation and forest degradation. There is growing recognition that for the global economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis to be durable and resilient, it must be environmentally sustainable and inclusive. In this regard, the forest sector has unique opportunity to contribute to building back better, play a leading role in the transition to a green, healthy and resilient future. It is clear that a broad, multi-sectoral approach is required to meet the challenge of COVID-19 recovery. Foresters and forestry-related actors around the globe should seize this opportunity to take the stage in global discussion on sustainability, climate, health, and biodiversity. Forests and trees are an important element of nature-positive solution. That is, action taken to protect, sustainable manage, and restore natural or production ecosystems, while simultaneously providing for human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Goods and services from nature are worth trillions, and nature-positive solutions, including forests and trees, can deliver significant socioeconomic benefits. Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, let me highlight some of the potential roles forestry can play in a greener post-pandemic future. First, forests cover 1/3 of the world's land surface. The economy and human well-being depend on the functional integrity of forest ecosystem. The ongoing forest loss due to conversion to other land uses and the degradation of forests by unsustainable use pose important risk to the society and the planet. In addition, forests are also affected by climate change and are threatened by an increasing frequency and severity of storms, drought, wildfire, and insect attacks. Investing in enhancing resilience and biodiversity of forests as part of policy response to the COVID-19 pandemic can help reduce the risks. Second, forests are home for millions of people who depend on them for their livelihoods. Many belong to the poorest and most vulnerable segment of society that have been strongly affected by the pandemic. Maintaining healthy and resilient forests and investing in restoring degraded land at scale should therefore be considered in COVID-19 response and economic recovery plans to leave no one behind. Third, productive and healthy forests produce a multitude of goods and services for the benefit of society and sustainable economic development. They are central element to a circular bioeconomy based on sustainably produced materials that can be recycled and reused. Healthy forests contribute to the creation of green jobs, including through nature-based recreation and ecotourism, and they provide renewable energy. And finally, forests have direct and indirect positive effects on the health and well-being of people. And I think we have discussed throughout this week the multitude of effects and contribution forests can have, socioeconomic and also for the well-being. They not only provide medicines, but scientific studies show the benefits of spending time in forests for physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. This has proven to be particularly important during the pandemic, when the recreational use of forests increased in many countries, especially by urban population. It has led to a new appreciation of forests that should not be lost in the post-COVID-19 period. Colleagues, friends, the pandemic has changed many lives, but it should also change the way we interact with our natural environment, including our forests. We need bold action on prevention through strengthening integrated, interdisciplinary, and cross-sectoral approaches, such as One Health approach, in order to better address the root causes of zoonotic spillover and prevent the emergency of pandemics. The One Health approach has changed the way of doing business, and it is moving in the right direction. But it needs to better involve the forestry, wildlife, and environment sectors. Resilient is a word that has gained new importance through the pandemic, and that applies to ecosystems as well as economies. COVID-19 presents an opportunity to shift the global development paradigm towards more sustainability and a greener, more inclusive economic development that address the climate crisis and biodiversity loss, as well as poverty. In this context, current challenge in the forestry sector can be turned into vehicles for transformation, driving economic and behavioral change. Ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to today's presentation and discussion. to hear about your particular experience with lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic in relation to forests and your thoughts on how to build back better with forests. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madame Helena Semedo, for your stimulating keynote address, which sets the scene perfectly for this session. Madame Semedo is Deputy Director General at the FAO, and she is an economist and a politician from Cape Verde. A leading expert in global development issues, Madame has worked in public service for over 30 years. Over the last decade, she has been very busy building and helping the FAO with their work to shape a new global narrative, where agriculture is now prominently featured and recognized as a solution to addressing increasingly complex emerging issues, from transforming food systems to dealing with climate change, and now with the added complication of figuring out a way between the agricultural and the forestry sectors. So we welcome your speech. Thank you, Madam. Another big hand. Oh, yes.
Yes, in this next segment of the session, we'll have four distinguished governmental discussants from various parts of the world, discussing the impacts and the near-term responses of the COVID-19 pandemic for the forest sector. And there'll be four discussants. Two of them will be joining us remotely, and two of them are here today. So what I'd like to do is very briefly introduce each of our guests, and those who are here, after I've introduced you, you can come up to take a seat on the stage. First on our list is Ms. Angela Coleman, who is the Associate Chief of the U.S. Forest Service. Angela has been in this position for some time and has actually 27 years of service in the U.S. Forest Service, with a number of responsibilities at regional and national levels. She has a very, very strong background in communications and has ample opportunity to use this in her work, in dealing with the public and in communicating the value of the mission, the value of the work that the Forest Service does for the people of the U.S. So we welcome Angela to this program. The next of our discussants is Dian Sukmajaya from the ASEAN Economic Community Department. He is a senior forest officer in the Food and Agriculture and Forestry Division of the ASEAN Economic Community Department in the ASEAN Secretariat. His responsibilities are very broad. They cover the areas of sustainable forest management, forest law enforcement and governance, forest products development, social forestry, CITES and wildlife enforcement, and forests and climate change. He's also responsible to promote the dialogue on nature-based solutions and decarbonization efforts in forestry sectors. So we welcome Dian. And here with us today at the venue in Seoul is Peter Gondo from the UN Forum on Forests Secretariat. Peter, a Zimbabwean citizen, is a senior forest specialist, currently serving as interregional advisor on sustainable forest management at the UNFF Secretariat, based in New York. He has more than 30 years' experience in forest management and forest research. His current focus is on mobilizing resources for supporting implementation of sustainable forest management, with a particular emphasis on the priorities of the Global Forest Financing Facilitation Network under the UN Strategic Plan for Forests. So welcome, Peter. It's great to have you. And finally, we have Dr. Rosalie Matondo, who's the Ministry of Forest Economy in the Republic of Congo. So Minister Matondo she was the Minister of Forest Economy, Sustainable Development and Environment for the Republic of Congo from 2016 and 2017. when she was appointed to her current position as Minister of Forest Economy. Before having this position, she had a number of other, many other high-level positions with broad responsibilities. She is also a PhD in agronomic sciences from the Institute of Genetic Engineering at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and has conducted research in forest genetics for many years. She is the author of numerous scientific publications. So we welcome Madame Matondo. I believe she's on her way.
She's possibly on her way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so perhaps first I'd like to ask Dion to make his presentation. So whoever is.
Hello.
Thank you. Yes.
Yay.
Thank you, John. Can I share presentation here from here?
Everything seems fine. Thank you, Dion.
Okay. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much, John, and also colleague Syam Satguru. And first of all, before my presentations on sharing the impact of COVID-19 pandemic for the forest sector in the region, I would like to highly appreciate for the organizer for inviting the ASEAN Secretariat to this very special event on the role of forest in a post-COVID-19 recovery. My presentations will be very brief on introduction on ASEAN cooperation on forestry, and then what are the impact of COVID-19 in forestry, and then how the regional cooperation response to this COVID-19 pandemic impact, and then also several priority areas post-COVID-19 pandemic. On the ASEAN cooperation in forestry, I just would like to very brief inform that the forestry cooperation is under the purview of the ASEAN senior officials on forestries that cover relevant areas, including sustainable forest management, FLEGT, wildlife enforcement, forest climate change, and social forestry. The ASOP is supported by the 5 working groups, namely ASEAN Working Group on CITES and Wildlife Enforcement, ASEAN Working Group on Forest Management, Social Forestry, Forest Product Development, and Forest and Climate Change. So, what are the impact of COVID-19 in ASEAN region? In general, and I believe it also impact the other regions, the pandemic has hit socio-economic to the people, community living within and surrounding the forest. And I think in a certain extent, it also has influenced the environment and ecological stability. To be more precise, and in ASEAN region, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic has reduced export of wood, pulp, paper, sawn timber, and other that produced by the ASEAN member state. Whereas drop of timber export from 9% to 30% has hit the region, including some countries, for example, in Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Laos, PDR, between 2019 to 2020. This study based on the European Forest Institute study. And then, however, some countries like Indonesia and Thailand proved to be resilient, although recorded fell in very early pandemic in 2020, but could rebound it and recorded the increased export from 2019 to 2021. The pandemic also has affected the employment, in particular in forest industries, and it creates employment issues in this region, and also has affected livelihood, and in certain extent also impact food security for vulnerable community forestry families due to the limitation of movement, and also it creates the disruption of logistical arrangement on food crops and also for the timber. The pandemic also has impacted the conservation activities and increased expansion of agriculture lands in some area. And surprisingly, the impact also has negative effect to the illicit wildlife online trading and also domestic trading that has been reported by ASEAN member state increasing during the pandemic situation. And some ASEAN member states also reported that activities related to the plantation and reforestation activities has been slowing down. And however, to be positive impact also happened during the pandemic. It shows that there are increasing domestic tourism to nature-based areas in most ASEAN member states. That experienced visitors are increasing to the forest area, to the national park, and they do some open activities in those areas. Now, how the ASEAN's dealing with this pandemic? During the 37th summit in November 2020, the ASEAN leaders has adopted the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and its implementation plan that serve as region's consolidated strategy from COVID-19 crisis. Basically, the ICRF lay out 5 broad strategies, including health system, strengthening human security, maximizing the potential of intra-ASEAN market, and accelerating inclusive digital transformation, as well as advancing toward a more sustainable and resilient future. I would like to also highlight what earlier mentioned by the DG, FAO, that cross-sectoral approach is indispensable and very important to deal with this pandemic situation, in particular related to the One Health and to improve food security system in this region. Relevant measures under this comprehensive framework, including to implement ASEAN guidelines on promoting responsible investment in food, agriculture, and forestry, promote awareness on the risk of zoonotic diseases transmission from wildlife trade. ASEAN is developing the ASEAN strategy for preventing transmission of zoonotic diseases from wildlife trade, and also underline the importance to promote nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approach to prevent future pandemics through cross-sectoral collaboration, as well as to promote climate-smart agriculture and sustainable agriculture in this region. On the conclusion, despite the negative impact of COVID-19 pandemic, forestry sectors actually has proved to be resilient to the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. At the regional level, ASEAN has taken immediate action through adoption of the ACRF, and the ACRF will complement the national interventions against COVID-19 crisis. I just would like to also highlight that at present, sustainable forest management still as a backbone for the ASEAN cooperation in forestry. And for us as forester, I think it should be essential to ensure sustainability of forest resources for socio-economic benefit and environmental sustainability in any regions, let's say climate change regime, and also during the pandemic situation. ASEAN's need to enhance sustainable forest management practices through several measures, including unlock potential of nature-based solution, ecosystem-based approach in forestry sector to support green job creation, improve community livelihood. And I think for the nature-based solution, we can also engage our colleague from Singapore to promote urban forestry so that they can also involve actively under the dialogue on social forestry. ASEAN also try to support sustainable responsible investment in enhancing forest potential in facing multiple crises. There should be more solutive actions to reduce deforestation and land degradation. And also ASEAN is prioritized areas on promoting decarbonization effort and circularity in forestry sector, as well as strengthen social forestry practices and promote marketability of non-timber forest product to improve livelihood. I think those very relevant to the promoting nature-based solution and decarbonization efforts, of which ASEAN is moving forward to promote ASEAN carbon neutrality. Last but not least, we as foresters should never forget that forest has and always be contributed to sustainable development, can support economic growth while also ensuring ecological sustainability and provide social beneficiaries. COVID-19 pandemic has proved that forestry has its resilient and provide many opportunities for communities locally regionally, and even globally. We need to enhance our forests as natural capital and further promote green initiative and global green value chains through more action-oriented beyond strengthening commitment. As foresters, I personally also would like to highlight that we should not leave the forest behind. Instead of, we need to showcase to the world that the forest is indispensable to protect our earth, despite, of course, the importance of issues related to the climate change and other issues related to the food security. Forests can contribute to those areas. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and back to you, to John. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Dian, for a very comprehensive and interesting overview of the impacts of the pandemic in the ASEAN region, as well as what is being done now and plans for the future to address these impacts and hopefully build back better in the process. Next, I would like to ask Peter to speak, and I'd like to remind all of our panelists that would like to keep your statements within 8 minutes. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John. I'll try to do that. Good afternoon, colleagues. In 2020, the United Nations Forum on Forests was asked by members of the forum to assess the impacts of the pandemic on forests and the forest sector, focusing particularly on impacts on industry, impacts on forest management, impacts on forest-dependent people, and also overall impacts in terms of economic development. We conducted a global study of these impacts, and the results were presented during the Forum's 16th session. During that session, there was also a request from members of the Forum to look at what challenges countries are experiencing in actually trying to implement recovery and response measures. And I'll just share some of the outcomes of those two assessments that we conducted. Of course, I have to put a caveat that the pandemic is still ongoing, and we conducted the studies at a very preliminary stage. So some of the indications are still very preliminary, but I think they give us very good pointers. The first thing, of course, that we found out was that in terms of forest management, the major impact was that forest management activities, especially tree planting, protection, were disrupted, and a lot of the activities were postponed or delayed. But that did not always culminate in loss of forests. In fact, in some cases, we actually saw some positive developments where forests, because of reduced activity, because of reduced logging, we actually saw some recovery starting to take place. So that was quite a positive outcome. Another outcome that we saw, of course, was the major impact was on forest industries. There was a major disruption of supply chains, as the Deputy Director General has already highlighted. Exports in timber were essentially reduced to a very large extent. It also affected the importation of spares and equipment for industry. So we found that a lot of the industrial work in many countries was reduced. But on another side, there were some positive outcomes as well. In many countries, especially in developing countries, and even in some developing countries, forest industries were classified as essential services, mainly for the provision of hygiene and protection equipment. So, and this actually led to an increase in activities of some of these industries. In fact, in Latin America, we saw that there was a very small decline in industrial activity. When it came, however, to ecosystem-based activities, especially hospitality activities. These were drastically affected because of the travel restrictions. So the tourism essentially died off. Many countries were affected by this because of travel restrictions, and a lot of people who depend on this for employment and livelihoods were negatively affected. They lost their incomes, they lost their source of livelihood. Another development which is linked to health was the fact that in many developed countries we started seeing a huge jump in the use of forests for recreation and mental health. This was reported especially in Eastern Europe and North America. So this also now has actually brought in a new impetus for the importance of urban and peri-urban forests as we move forward. Another development which I think which related to forest workers, and I think this needs to be looked at in connection with other sectors, was that a lot of forest employees are not on social protection. And many of the measures that were put in place to support people to cushion them against the effects of the pandemic did not reach forest-dependent people. And I think as we move forward, we also need to look at how to make sure that we have inclusive social protection measures that include people who live in and around forests. The last impact I want to highlight was actually the positive use of technology. When in many countries they could not do law enforcement physically or monitor what was going on in the forest physically, they turned to technology, satellite imagery, drones, and other technologies. And for some administrative activities, they turned to digital technology, where, for example, processing of permits and agreements was actually done online. So we saw this increase in use of digital technology, and I think it actually offers a new opportunity as we move forward. Now, when we looked at the recovery measures, the study indicated that for the countries that are making rapid progress, sustainable forest management has been made an integral part of the recovery plans. And we have seen this especially in Europe and in North America. You'll find that there are actually specific budgets that have been provided for sustainable forest management. The issue of landscape restoration, especially in relation to the One Health approach, the issue of ensuring habitat connectivity as a component of landscape restoration is also an important measure that has been adopted by some countries, and it is recommended, I think, as we move forward to closely take a look at this. But as we have noticed, because for the developing countries, their fiscal space or the amount of financial resources they have to deal with the recovery and response to the pandemic, they don't have many resources. They have very limited resources to invest in sustainable forest management. And given the importance of forests, I think international cooperation is very critical. And we have already started seeing some partnership between different partners in the north, the developed countries, multilateral development banks, partnering with countries to start developing these recovery strategies, which include forestry. I think I would end there in terms of I can add later. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay.
Thank you, Peter. Actually, I'd like to thank you very much for your really superb synthesis of a very, very large body of knowledge that came from the regional studies in that UNFF assessment. I think you've summarized for us extremely well what the major impacts have been, what the regional differences we've seen, and also what's being done so far in terms of short-term recovery. So thank you very much for that work. Our next speaker is Angela Coleman, who is with us from 11 time zones away, so we really appreciate her flexibility and her commitment to providing her insights to this session. So Angela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. I hear an echo.
It's okay from our side. No, we're not hearing you at all now, so I think we need a little technical support.
Let's try now. Can you hear me now?
Fine, I think it's fine now.
Okay. Your Excellencies, Madam Minister, distinguished panelists, delegates, and colleagues in Seoul and around the world. It is a privilege to speak to you today at this special session, the role of forests in a post-COVID-19 recovery. First, I want to commend the Korea Forest Service and FAO for convening the world's forestry community. We are excited to have this opportunity to share knowledge and learn from you. The mission of the U.S. Forest Service is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. And like you, we faced tremendous adversity in fulfilling our mission during the COVID-19 pandemic. I work in downtown Washington, D.C. at the Forest Service headquarters. And when we got orders to shut down our offices and work from home, I naively thought it would be just for a few weeks. I dropped a few things in my briefcase, picked up my laptop computer, and left my office. I couldn't have been more wrong. Over the last 2 years, we literally managed and oversaw our agency mission of 30,000 employees, a multi-billion-dollar budget, and a national emergency response to national record wildfires from our desks in our homes, connected only by electronic devices, with only occasional visits to the field and occasional visits back to our offices. None of us have ever lived through anything like this before. And let us admit, the United States was hit hard. As of late April, the US had recorded 81 million cases of COVID infections with about 990,000 deaths. We're going to touch 1 million at some point. We are forever changed by these 2 years and are just now preparing our re-entry to our physical offices. Now, we're a field-going organization, but a good bit of our employees do report to offices in the physical space, and they've been away from those offices for 2 years. And they're now preparing by June to resume at least a hybrid of that work, going half-time or smaller portions, or dividing time between being in person and being at home to do their work or teleworking elsewhere. But we've learned a lot about our management over the last 2 years, and we'll be applying it to our future mission and recovery efforts in our country. So we appreciate the opportunity to share how this crisis has changed our work and how it will aid recovery. During the COVID pandemic, we saw unprecedented levels of wildfire activity in the Western United States. And like other countries, when it comes to managing wildland fire, our first priority is to protect the health, the safety, and well-being of our wildland firefighters and the communities we serve. Forest Service works with other federal as well as tribal, state, local, and private partners to safely deploy firefighting resources during an extended attack on fire. Although the current rate of COVID-19 has dropped to a more manageable level, despite the variants we're seeing rise up, causing an uptick right now. We still are taking our mitigation measures very seriously to protect firefighters and communities in compliance with recommendations from health professionals. In adjusting our operations, we learned a lot about how we manage fires over the last 2 years and will continue to include best practices like smaller fire camps and remote incident management support when we can. Our dispersed operations not only minimize the spread of COVID-19, but it also improved the overall health and availability of our firefighters in a very long and arduous year of firefighting. Firefighting crews reported they were much healthier because they avoided common sicknesses through their social distancing. In short, much of what we learned can be applied to the post-COVID time that we are entering to improve our wildland fire management overall. And as Winston Churchill once said, never let a good crisis go to waste. President Biden's executive order strengthening the nation's forests and communities and economies focuses in part on restoring ecological integrity across vast areas of forests in the United States. In response to the wildfire crisis in the Western United States, we recently unveiled a national 10-year strategy to restore healthy, resilient, fire-adapted forests across high-priority landscapes at the actual scale of the risk. We plan to dramatically increase fuels and forest health treatments by up to 4 times over our current treatment levels. In doing this work, firefighters and specialists will draw on what they learned from managing wildland fire during the pandemic to complete this urgent and badly needed work in a safe and effective way. But forests in the US play another role in our post-COVID recovery. The greatest economic benefits in connection with forests in the US come from outdoor recreation. In 2020, according to the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis, outdoor recreation accounted for 1.8% of the gross domestic product, with about $374 billion in contributions to the national economy. National forests and grasslands account for 19% of recreation in the United States, and these lands produced more than 370,000 jobs and contributed more than $35 billion to the economy. Overall, our safety precautions with COVID led to restrictions on many of our developed recreation sites. Yet, the pandemic led to unprecedented levels of recreation use. From 2019 to 2020, recreational use rose by 18 million visits. That's 168 million visits. The reason? People wanted to seek dispersed recreation to get away from COVID stress by walking, viewing nature, or just relaxing. It's unclear whether this high use will persist, but in any case, forests in the United States will remain tremendously important for all the recreational and health benefits and for all the related contributions to the jobs, tourism, and the overall economy. As a result, the Forest Service is focusing on rebuilding and restoring infrastructure to address facilities and maintenance backlogs. The Great America Outdoors Act is funding some of this work. In addition, we benefited from infrastructure from the recently passed Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It provides historic funding to support our work on the 10-year strategy. This funding creates jobs and aids economic recovery and stability. At the same time, it helps us deliver our goals to restore resilient, healthy, and productive forests across all landscapes over time. Thank you for this opportunity to share our view from the United States, and I look forward to the continuing conversation.
Thank you very much, Angela, for very descriptive and interesting overview of how the U.S. has dealt with COVID, and particularly in the forest sector, what it meant to the U.S. Forest Service, and especially sharing with us some of the positive, proactive measures being taken thanks to all the COVID relief funding that's been flowing through from the U.S. government. So there's actually some very good news there. So again, appreciate all of your thoughts and information that you provided. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end of the session to come back to our speakers in this first part of the session, in which case I hope Angela and Dion, you can stay with us in case there are some questions near the end of the session. But for now, I would like to again thank all of our panelists in this part of our session. I'd like to open the second chapter of this story which will be looking more to the future and how to enhance the role of forests in supporting a greener and more resilient economy in the post-pandemic or in the endemic era to come. And I'd like to start this part of the program off with a keynote presentation by Priya Shyamsundar, who is joining us remotely. No, I think she's actually sent her pre-recorded presentation, but it's a very interesting one. I'd like to say a few words about Priya. Yes, Priya Shyamsundar is a lead economist for the Nature Conservancy. At the Nature Conservancy, she leads a global science team that undertakes research on the economics of conservation and environmental management, including valuing the benefits, costs, and distributional implications of environmental interventions, and designing economic, policy, and behavioral nudges that encourage action. Priya's research covers a range of local conservation to global climate change issues, with a particular focus on economic development. So, with no further ado, could we please listen to Priya's presentation?
Thank you for this invitation. I must say that this is a unique invitation in that I've never had to be awake at 1 a.m. for a presentation before this. But I'm glad to be part of this important discussion on COVID recovery. I want to make the case that COVID recovery efforts can contribute to forest and tree-based strategies that can benefit millions of local communities and smallholders. I would like to show through this presentation that with some careful investments, smallholder-driven tree cover restoration can be a critical strategy for climate mitigation and sustainable development. First, as we all recognize, forest, trees, and poverty overlap. But to remind ourselves, about a fourth of the world's people live close to forests. Recent estimates from Erbog et al. Suggest that nearly 300 million people in low-income countries live in areas with restoration potential, and a great many people, particularly poor people, depend on forests and trees for their income and livelihoods. So as forests degrade or are restored, they affect the lives of millions. Communities who are forest and tree reliant face a number of global shocks simultaneously and on a regular basis. COVID-19 in the last 3 years falls into a set of such global shocks that are largely exogenous to the daily lives of these communities, but bring significant risks and opportunities. In recent work, we identified 6 such shocks that collectively have an impact on forest and tree-dependent communities. COVID-19 occurs in many forest-proximate areas where there is already high background rates of malaria, dengue, and other infectious diseases. Here, with COVID-19, poor communities have likely seen changes in labor and non-labor income, especially if their work is tied to forest-related tourism or disrupted forestry or agricultural supply chains, a decline in remittances and internal migration, increasing pressure on forests and trees and household consumption, significant health impacts, even existential threats in remote indigenous territories because of limited access to healthcare and ability to reduce spread. Thus, it is useful to think of a COVID recovery scenario as one that recognizes the cumulative risks posed by multiple global forces, including pandemics, on poor communities. In a business as usual scenario, these forces, in conjunction with limited rights, resources, and skills required to prosper from global changes, are likely to place poor and transient poor households under additional stress. Forests and trees can help the poor address these profound global changes, but policy integration is absolutely essential. I now want to shift to a very specific investment strategy as part of COVID recovery. Large-scale tree planting in agricultural and degraded forest lands is envisaged by international initiatives such as the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, the Bond Challenge, and NDCs to the Paris Agreement. Yet persistent concerns remain regarding the feasibility and social desirability of such efforts, stemming from implementation challenges, potential threats to food security and biodiversity, market risks, and potential exacerbation of inequities from ignoring local socioeconomic realities. This suggests a need for a portfolio approach to tree cover restoration that includes activities that range from tree planting by governments to agroforestry by smallholder communities. Smallholders who operate on less than 5 hectares of land dominate agricultural systems in low and middle income countries and can be a major force for global restoration. However, global or tropical level studies haven't been able to really evaluate this potential. Much is known about what motivates investments in tree planting by institutional investors and governments and factors that influence tree planting by individual smallholders, but the potential scale of smallholder restoration and the combination of conditions needed to achieve large increases in smallholder tree planting is poorly understood. Hence, I want to present some ongoing work where we identify dominant land cover and populations in areas with potential for low-cost restoration in the tropics. We also identify smallholder agricultural land shares in countries with low-cost restoration potential. Our overlays of land uses and population maps on previously available spatial data on areas with potential for low-cost restoration suggest the following. Most potential restorable areas in the tropics are largely being used as croplands or pasturelands. Panel A and Panel B in the slide. Potentially restorable areas in croplands are distributed fairly evenly amongst Asia, Africa, and the tropical Americas. In South and Southeast Asia, potential restorable areas are predominantly in croplands, over 70%. Pasturelands account for 45 to 40% of low-cost restorable lands in Africa and the Americas. Some 220, 59, and 22 million people live in areas that we have identified as potentially restorable cropland, pastureland, and degraded forest lands. So the bottom line is that a lot of the lands that are potentially restorable at low cost seem to be in agricultural or pastoral systems. At present, no global spatial dataset identifies smallholder agricultural areas. Thus, to show the dominant presence of smallholders in countries with restoration potential, we show the share of a country's agricultural areas operated by smallholders. Spatial data sets are also lacking for tenure arrangements under which potentially restorable land is held. The presence of large areas of land held by communities in some tropical countries points to the possibility of smallholders having an even larger rural footprint than indicated by published data on agricultural smallholdings. While we are able to show that there are many areas where low-cost restoration potential overlaps with agricultural systems dominated by smallholders, it is important to assess if macro-level conditions are also conducive to this form of restoration. Thus, we examine national policy governance and market conditions in 20 countries with the largest low-cost restoration potential. These indicators reflect conditions that can make tree planting less costly and increase private benefits to smallholders. The national indicators, unfortunately, point to the presence of constraints that may deter smallholders from undertaking restoration. For instance, only a third of the countries have a quantitative policy target for tree restoration as part of their NDCs. No country falls within the top quarter for any governance or market indicator pointing to policy and institutional barriers to smallholder restoration activities. Only 2 of the 20 countries rank high on EBA index, and the median time to market is less than an hour in only 7 countries, suggesting that market transaction costs may be quite high in several countries. Thus, there is clearly a need for reforms that can relax these constraints if smallholder restoration is to scale. Enabling conditions for tree cover restoration by smallholders manifest in different ways at subnational levels, which is where restoration activities are implemented. Thus, to understand implementation constraints to promoting restoration at scale, we brought together a group of experts who have some experience in this area. And this was a group that comprised of researchers and practitioners. The slide that you're looking at presents a typology of implementation constraints that emerged from these discussions. It also identifies emerging and demonstrated solutions to these constraints. While I can't go into details presented in this slide, I simply want to make the point that there is a lot of good work and experience that we can use to scale up smallholder restoration. Finally, 4 broad principles can act as guideposts for addressing the multiple challenges laid out in the last few slides. Restoration program first needs to align with farmer preferences, build on social norms, and address capacity needs. This will require upfront engagement with smallholders, building trusted partnerships, and prioritizing smallholder preferences where there are differences between global restoration and smallholder goals. Uncertainty regarding inputs and outcomes associated with tree planting needs need to be reduced. A set of lookup tables on appropriate species, tree survival rates, carbon accumulation rates, land and tree rights, etc., would reduce the transaction costs of reforestation or restoration investments by smallholders. policy reforms that increase revenues from tree products and make market transactions less costly and more widespread are absolutely essential. Financing from public and private resources will need to meet smallholder needs by expanding rural credit access, accepting varied forms of collateral, offering different insurance products, and loans with longer payback periods to allow for tree growth. So COVID recovery will require investments in these strategies that can help with both sustainable development and restoration goals. Finally, smallholder tree cover restoration, i.e., intentional actions undertaken by smallholder households or communities to grow trees on lands that were originally forested, can come in a variety of different forms. So I would request you to imagine a world where forest lands that underwent land use changes to become croplands, pasture lands, or degraded forest lands can, through smallholder actions, become lands that are under agro-silviculture, silvopasture, woodlands, plantations, or restored forest lands. Let's make the required investments in smallholder restoration as part of COVID recovery to make this a reality. Thank you so very much.
Well, that was an excellent presentation, and it's a pity she's not with us either virtually or in person, because I'm sure we could have a good conversation about that, about her excellent work on the analysis of the potential of smallholder restoration activities. But the next best thing, or perhaps even better, is the group of discussants that we have who may want to comment on what Priya had to say, but would also like to pose some additional questions within their areas of expertise. And at this point, I'd like to turn this over to my sister, Shyam.
Thank you so much, John. Now, I have the pleasure and the privilege of inviting our three discussants up on stage. Your Excellency, Ambassador Jose Carlos de Fonseca Jr., Executive Director of IBA, welcome. Dr. Robert Nasi, the Director General of C4 ACRAF, please come up. And finally, Dr. John Stanturf, Visiting Professor, Chair of Forest Management Planning, Estonian University of Life Sciences. Please give a big hand to all of them. Pleasure. Pleasure is all ours. Please. Welcome. May I just briefly introduce our three key discussants who are on the podium right now. His Excellency Ambassador Jose Carlos de Fonseca Jr. is the Executive Director of the IBA and had been in the Brazilian Forest Service for almost 4 decades. How old were you when you started in the Foreign Service? 10, probably. You know, you look too young. He joined the IBA 3 years ago. Throughout his career, he has held many postings abroad. His Excellency has also been a member of the Federal Parliament, representing his home state of Espírito Santo, and he still sits on the steering committee of the Forest Dialogue out of Yale University and on the International Council of Forests and Paper Association, ICFPA, besides being the Vice Chair on the Advisory Committee on the Sustainable Forest-Based Industry, AXFI, which comes under the FAO. His Excellency is also the co-facilitator of the Brazilian Climate Coalition, Forest and Agriculture, representing the private sector within the multi-stakeholder platform. Dr. Robert Nasi is a forest engineer holding a PhD in the field of ecology from the University of Paris-Sud, Ossé. Since 1982, Dr. Robert has gained considerable experience with extensive work being conducted in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, undertaking research activities in the fields of ecology, and the management of tropical forests. His work aims to integrate social and biological sciences for the better management of tropical forests, more sustainable livelihoods, and better designed forest policy. He's currently the Director General for the Center for International Forest Research, CIFOR, and he is the Managing Director of CIFOR ICRAF. Last but not least, we have Dr. John Stanter, Visiting Professor, Chair of Forest Management, Planning and Wood Processing Technologies, Estonian University of Life Sciences. Dr. John Stanter is a forest ecologist holding a PhD in forest soils from Cornell University. Previously, pre-retirement as a senior scientist from the US Forest Service. He consults now on forest restoration with a Danish consulting firm who conducts training on forest landscape restoration for IUFRO, where he serves as the deputy coordinator of the task force on transforming forest landscapes for future climates and human well-being. He works in temperate, boreal, and tropical forests globally. So as you can see, we have a highly distinguished panel of discussants here, and we will be throwing certain questions in turn to them for them to present their perspectives. May I also kindly please remind each of the discussants, can you please keep your responses rather brief to about 2 to 3 minutes each. And now I hand it back to my brother John to throw the first set of questions out to the first discussant. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Shyam. And on my part, thanks to all the panelists who agreed to subject themselves to these questions, but we know we're going to get a lot of insight in your answers. I'd like to direct the first question to Robert, and this is as follows. How can the forest sector position itself to effectively contribute to the post-COVID-19 recovery by supporting transformations that will also help addressing climate change and biodiversity crises?
Well, thanks, John. I mean, what we are facing now is that I think that we seem to have forgotten the better and the build back better. And I think that's where the forestry sector at large can bring this back into the equation. And I will not repeat again what was said by Peter, but I think by moving into what can be called forestry 4.0, by analogy to the industry 4.0, improving the use of digital technology, looking at innovation in terms of social innovation, and we have seen some proposal in terms of how we involve a local community, indigenous people, smallholders, looking at forestry beyond the classic forestry. I mean, it's sort of the importance of forest and trees in the urban environment in terms of buffering against wind, high temperature, the importance of forest in terms of mesoclimate. But look at what is happening in India this week. Well, someplace the temperature is at 60 degrees. So all these things could be improved, and could be if we address properly the various questions that unfortunately we have been facing for the last 30 years in the forestry sector, and we didn't seem to make a lot of progress. So I think that's the opportunity now, maybe that the COVID-19 pandemic will be the wake-up call. Say, okay, we have been largely degrading our forest, and we are paying the result of it. Now it's time to use the potential of the forest, trees, agroforestry sector, a smallholder, large corporation, whoever, then to build a world where, in fact, trees and forests play a significant role on sustainable development goals. Beyond that, I mean, it's a matter of political will, it's a matter of priority. I mean, we should invest enough on that and less in other things like military equipment. And we should do what we know. The point is that this is not a technological problem. We have the technological solution. It's a societal problem, and it's something where the society at all should react.
Thank you, Robert. I actually have a follow-up question for you, if you don't mind. This is a key, a very important question. What can the role of the forest sector be in protecting us against future pandemics?
I think we have to be realistic. I mean, forests don't really care very much whether we are affected by a pandemic or not. And I don't think that Mother Nature really bother about us. What is important to understand, and it's the fact that what we are facing now as COVID-19 is the result of an imbalance in the natural environment. Is what we have. We are just facing the monster that we have created, and we are in the COVID-19 pandemic. But let's not forget that another pandemic that has killed 38 million people and continue killing people, like HIV, comes also from inappropriate management or appropriate action in the forestry sector. So 80% of the emerging viral disease that we have seen emerging, and they are emerging more and more, they come from mismanagement of natural resources, and mostly forest. And so the role of the forestry sector in terms of protecting us against the next pandemic is more the role of human being in treating better forests, trees, and agroforestry, so that we don't have the problem that we are facing now. So there is a huge potential. I mean, we did some empirical study that showed that there is a high incidence of Ebola viral disease 2 years after deforestation. So if you don't deforest, you don't have that. And so on. So that's the thing that we need to understand. I mean, it's the onus is in our camp. I mean, the ball is in our camp. The forest will not do anything. This is for us to do what we have to do in terms of managing better this resource for building back better and avoiding the next problem.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much for those wonderfully insightful answers, Robert. And also, trying to not make it seem as if forests are the magic solutions to all of the world's problems. Thank you for that. Our next question is now directed to Your Excellency, Jose Carlos, and it relates to the opportunities and trade-offs for the forest sector in a post-COVID world. What do you think are the options for the forest sector to make itself more visible, engage in new partnerships and collaboration with other sectors of the economy in effecting the required changes?
Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to share this panel with such distinguished participants. Crises, as we know, also provide opportunities. And this was not different during this terrible crisis of the pandemic. The circumstance was an opportunity for the plantation-based sector to highlight the essentiality of our activities and products. In Brazil, for example, the Brazilian tree industry, BA, was very quick, had to be very quick in reinforcing its institutional and advocacy dialogue with local and federal governments in order to demonstrate precisely that essentiality. This rapid movement that we made was key to avoiding the mandatory closing of factories and operations, and thus reducing potential economic losses, for instance. Some of the essential uses we then highlighted to convince our regulators and authorities. That paper, for instance, paper packaging to receive food and medication in our homes. We relied on opening operations for our companies. Cellulose pulp for manufacturing personal protective equipment such as masks. Charcoal, a bioreducer used to produce special types of steel used in surgical instruments for hospitals. Laminate flooring, boards, and aggregate panels, for instance, used to build field hospitals and to renovate people's homes during the pandemic. So the pandemic kind of accelerated certain trends, like the establishment of the sustainability agenda, the challenges presented by climate change, and the new ESG attitude for investors in general. The post-COVID economic recovery promises to have these agendas as a permanent background. This is a great opportunity for the forest-based economy to showcase its natural attributes and position itself as a distinguished provider of sustainable solutions. We shall not miss this boat. We need to improve our communication skills, but we will not be able to do this by ourselves as foresters only, so we need to establish and engage in the right partnerships.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for that very comprehensive answer that you've given us. Now, I have a follow-up question for you based on what you've just said. How can new technology further support decision-making and transformation in forestry? Thank you.
Innovation, R&D are a part of our nature, really. I can speak this for Brazil, but this is true in many other countries. We have been investing to making alternatives, to produce alternatives to raw materials that come from fossil sources, fossil-based items. Several solutions are emerging from these efforts, these investments, and moving to the production in such new items, more and more incorporating technology and innovation, like packaging barriers with potentially antioxidant and antimicrobial properties for use in the food industry. Through nanotechnology, cellulose can gain strength, impermeability, and conductivity, for instance, as properties, making its products a sustainable alternative for use in the textile industry, for fabrics, in bandages, in hand sanitizers, paints, and concrete, and many other new applications. Lignin, for instance, has enormous potential to replace phenol and polyurethane in resins or to produce bio-oils, not to speak of, for instance, engineered wood and engineered timber for construction and so on. Alongside with these new products and many others, our sector has been investing in better data use and artificial intelligence in order to make ever more assertive decision-making and adapt our managerial practices. This is not the particularity, of course, of our sector, but the sector is not trailing behind many of the other avant-garde, let's say, segments in the economy that are very intensive on innovation like we are.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I have to say I can't agree more with what you're saying right now. A lot of people tend to assume that the forest and the wood sector are about 2 or 3 decades behind everybody else, but in actual fact, it's the complete opposite. Maybe we're just not all that good at telling the story or shouting out our successes. So thank you so much for all those answers. Okay. You next.
Thanks from my side as well. I have a three-part question for Dr. Stanturf, as follows. Opportunities and trade-offs, how can forestry make the economy greener? Part one. How can forests contribute to sustainable pathways? And finally, what are the opportunities for job creation, improvement in livelihoods of forest communities? So it's a big package of questions there, but I know you're capable.
Thank you, John. Since I have 3 questions, that means I get 6 minutes. No? Okay.
You do have 6 minutes. You do.
You know, I think that one way to look at COVID was that it was a stress test on society. It exposed weaknesses and vulnerabilities that have been highlighted by some of the speakers already, but it also provides us, or showed that we have some strengths and provides us with some opportunities. And I think that's what I want to talk about. One of the big responses was to try to stimulate the economy and try to counteract the economic hit that COVID put on, especially developing countries, but also in developed countries. The idea was to target recovery funds at activities that mitigate climate warming and biodiversity loss rather than a business as usual approach to supporting existing carbon-intensive industries. That would have many, many benefits besides responding to the economic stress of COVID. Stimulus and recovery spending should be, and has been to some extent, directed towards infrastructure that supports a more progressive future than a return to business as usual. Now, I see this playing out in the forestry sector in 5 areas: forest restoration, wildfire, urban greening, bioeconomy, and workforce development. We've already heard some bits about some of these issues, so I'll try not to be too duplicative of what's already been said. Restoring degraded forests, especially in the US and Canada, could potentially contribute to the green economy. And I stress US and Canada because that's my experience, but it's also, those are 2 very important forest, high forest cover countries, but also contributing a great deal to forest products supply and demand around the world. Both countries have proposed to scale up tree planting efforts on the order of billions of trees. Some of that was in the works before COVID and was further motivated by the spending from the infrastructure development in response to COVID. But again, we got to remember that restoration is about more things than just planting trees. It includes managing existing forests more sustainably and in particular more resilient in the face of climate change. As Angela Coleman talked about, especially in the US, the pandemic coincided with a very bad wildfire year, the first year of the pandemic, and it has continued. Wildfire has been a major concern for globally, and this is only going to increase under climate change. Areas that have not been subjected to wildfire historically are likely to begin to feel those effects as climate warms and dries in some areas. So the lessons that we've learned in North America and Australia, especially on how to live in fire-adapted or fire-influenced communities, has global application. But to be honest, in North America in particular, we have a legacy of trying to suppress all fires. So there's a lot of hazardous fuels out there. So even though we're now paying attention to more holistic fire management, we have a big problem with trying to overcome some of the past management. The pandemic has exacerbated the pre-existing shortage of wildland firefighters, and the recovery plan in the US and Canada has attempted to address this problem. And honestly, so far it's only had mixed results. So turning to urban greening, the pandemic's highlighted, as several speakers have already said, the importance of forests to social well-being and increase the utilization of parks and natural areas. And I think the forest sector can capitalize on this, especially in terms of urban greening and urban rewilding that's gained a lot of attention as people have sought the outdoors to overcome the isolation effects of COVID. It's increased prominence in trying to increase natural habitats in urban settings, but what's often missed in some of these efforts is that urban forests need to be managed in order to be sustainable and in particular to be safe for the people that are recreating in them. That's an opportunity for the forest sector, the forestry community, to reach urban dwellers and perhaps create teachable moments about the need for management in human-dominated natural systems. The US and Canada and other countries in Europe and other places have provided new funding to help manufacturers improve their manufacturing processes, not only to increase efficiency, but to reduce waste and pollution while increasing profits. The governments have increased some spending in R&D and developing new products. And one of the things that I think we need to look at in the future is, as we go to a more carbon-based economy, a less fossil fuel carbon-based economy, is that we're going to be looking at forests to provide the raw materials for a lot of different products. You know, I have a plastic bottle here. There's a great effort underway right now to make such containers from wood-based material or plant-based material rather than fossil fuel-based material. So as we try to protect and sustainably manage forests, we're also going to be requiring greater and greater supply and demand of forest products. Finally, labor shortages and supply chain disruption were apparent in many countries as a result of COVID. And it sparked thinking, especially in North America, about the need for training for skilled workers, such as mill operators, maintenance, forest road planning, construction, prescribed burners. All of these people became in short supply under COVID because of the worker safety rules that were put in place, but also as people became infected and had to isolate at home, there were, in many cases, there were no trained workers to take their place. And hence, in fact, it even affected mills and shutting down production lines in some manufacturing facilities in North America because of these worker shortages. And one problem that pre-existed the pandemic that's only become more and more of a problem in the supply chain disruption is that hauling and truck drivers are in short supply. And that's been a real bottleneck in the wood supply chain in North America. Some efforts are directed at overcoming that, but some people argue that it's not a lack of training, it's that we have deregulated some industries to the point where those jobs are just not attractive. And we're seeing that in many industries. People are realizing that, you know, maybe I just don't need that low-paying, stressful job anymore. So there's a great deal of disruption in labor markets. So over the next few years, we're going to see some of these effects play out in greater detail, some things that we haven't anticipated. And you know, hopefully we won't see the emergence of another pandemic, but as Robert has pointed out, that's unlikely that we'll have that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was an excellent, again, coverage of a wide radar of issues, but excellently captured. Thank you to John. Now, in the interest of time, I mean, I noticed that we're already 2 minutes over time, but considering we started 5 minutes late, I hope that the audience is quite happy just to sit tight for a further 5 minutes. Just to wrap up the session quickly, maybe we can take one question from the audience, and please indicate which panel member you are directing your question to. I think we can take perhaps one before we have to sum up and end this marvelous session. Any takers? If there are no takers, we'll proceed immediately to the sum. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, are we good? Okay, right. Now I'm going to do a very feeble attempt at trying to summarize this session that has had inputs from such highly distinguished speakers and also presenters, virtually as well as in person. What we have gleaned from what the speakers from the session 1 and also our discussants from session 2 have contributed are almost as follows. The first point is further collaboration with other sectors and partnerships with other sectors and other players really needs to be accelerated. Forestry, the forestry sector simply cannot do this alone. This needs to be accompanied with far more creative and accessible funding and investment, underpinned by political will and also support from the other sectors, which includes the financial sector. The second point is opportunities are to be capitalized upon now. They are not to be missed. Act now, especially so on the low-cost restoration, particularly in the tropics that was presented by Priya, and also for all the other potential low-hanging fruit elements that have been mentioned by a number of the speakers at this session today. Third it is also confirmed that further efforts to restore production forests and landscapes has accelerated as a result of the pandemic situation, and this has also accelerated product innovation, not just in the wood sector, but also in other sectors that are tending to favor nature-based solutions and natural raw materials rather than man-made, chemically focused, environmentally less friendly materials. The next point is a lot more focus needs to be placed on assisting smallholders by introducing the concepts of agroforestry to them, but not to forget or not to assume that this will benefit them. So there needs to be further consultation and further consolidation, actually, in trying to bring the smallholders together and also introducing these new concepts, particularly the trees outside forests, meaning trees outside forest boundaries. New technology is to be celebrated, particularly in the bio-oil sector, which has enhanced the engineering of wood products and other products. And the underlining factor here is the forest sector is not behind. Next, the restoration and the fires, unprecedented levels of forest fires need immediate addressing, they need immediate attention, and it's good that the global community has actually responded to this in the last 2 years. That's from our observations. And interestingly enough, the COVID situation has actually presented an increased demand for wood fiber in almost every sector, either from the pulp and paper sector, the actual wood product sector, the heating sector as well, cooking sector, multiple sectors. Why? Because there is a need to move away from fossil fuels. This, of course, has accelerated and enhanced the sustainability agenda on the global level and also on the national level. And one of our speakers mentioned the ESGs, the environmental and social guidelines. Now, the uptake of the ESGs is rather, how would I say this? It's not standard. Yes, it's not standard in all economies. So this is something that we need to keep an eye on, just to make sure that the uptake of ESGs by certain nations don't put others at a disadvantage. And my personal observation on all this is the COVID disruptions has also enhanced the development level of domestic markets rather than the export-orientated markets. So we will see an increasing uptake in domestic markets on the use of legal and sustainably produced wood products. Why? This is due to the disruption that has been caused in the last 2 years at least to the COVID-19 pandemic, which John mentioned in his, so did Ambassador Jose Carlos. Bottlenecks, disruption in market diversions or disruption in market supplies, and also fractured supply chains. The other big elephant in the room, of course, is the non-COVID related crisis that is sitting on the fringe of what we are facing right now. It is a little bit too early to tell what kind of impacts that the non-COVID related crisis will have on the wood and forestry sector, but it could potentially have impacts on deforestation or forest degradation, both, I don't say both, sorry, in all three, temperate, boreal, and tropical forestry. But that's a topic for another discussion at another time. With that, may I take this moment and privilege to thank my co-moderator, Dr. John Parota. A big hand for all our keynote speakers, our earlier presenters, and also our very distinguished discussants, and all the more our thank you to you as the audience for sitting through and listening to us. Thank you so much. This session is now officially closed. Thank you again.